when I think of the Puritans and pastoral ministry, the representative work that comes to mind is Baxter the Reformed pastor. Now, unfortunately, once again, Baxter is going to experience persecution as a result of another change in political circumstances. So he goes into the ministry during the reign of Charles I. Civil war breaks out. He's really driven out of the town where he was pastoring because the vast majority of the city is of one particular political persuasion. Baxter was of a minority view for reasons that we've already discussed. They think he's a traitor, so he was driven out. He then becomes a chaplain. He sees all kinds of death, carnage, things like this, all of which even then served as the very poignant occasion and catalyst for him to direct his mind to heaven. He himself was dealing with the reality of apparently being very close to death. God brought him through that. He then eventually returns to Kidderminster during the Commonwealth of Cromwell, and really, as we had mentioned earlier when we were going through that overview of the Stuart period, it was during Cromwell's Commonwealth that there was considerable freedom for those who either were part of the institutional establishment of the Church of England but wanted to operate within it differently, as was Baxter's case. Again, as we mentioned a couple of days ago in that overview, there were Baptists, there were Quakers, there were many other groups who were able to act with almost complete and total freedom, because that was Cromwell's religious policy. Cromwell, being an independent, more or less, at least during his tenure, disestablished the very centralized structure of the institutional Church of England, turned them all into autonomous, independent type churches. And so it's within that kind of context that Baxter was ministering with considerable freedom there in Kidderminster. But then, in 1658, Cromwell died. And between 1658 and 1660, as we recall, his son Richard proved to be relatively weak and incompetent and not capable really of functioning as Lord Protector as his father was. And so in the meantime, Parliament, which Cromwell had dissolved through Pride's Purge, reconstituted, and as we recall, they recall Charles I's son, who's in exile in France. They recall him back to England. He resumes the throne in 1660, and for that reason, that period of 1660 is known as the Restoration. So now, Baxter's ministry, what makes it so interesting is that his ministry goes through the latter part of the reign of Charles I. It goes through the Civil War. The most fruitful aspect of that ministry thrived during Cromwell's Commonwealth, and now it's running right into the period of the Restoration. And it's going to be this era of the Restoration when the monarchy, when not only the monarchy is restored, but the centralized institutional Church of England is also restored. And then Baxter is going to be on the very negative receiving end of all that. So Cromwell's Commonwealth ends in his death. As we just stated, the monarchy is restored in 1660. And then in 1662, as we mentioned, much of the centralized institutional Church of England is restored through a new Act of Uniformity. And as we recall, this new Act of Uniformity, it officially reinstituted the episcopacy. It mandated the use of a revised version of the Book of Common Prayer. And so in sum, this Act of Uniformity of 1662 is very definitively prescribed how the church should be run. It also further prescribed what pastors said, what pastors would wear, and how people were to participate in the Sunday services. Now, many pastors, as we observed a couple of days ago, objected to these measures on the basis that they believed they were unbiblical. And by the way, this is one of the very, very contentious points between a lot of those who self-identified as Puritans and many of those who were very much in favor of the institutional establishment as defined by the Elizabethan settlement, and then further maintained by the Stuarts, James I, Charles I, up to this point, and now it's all going to be revamped and even more defined under Charles II, with this Act of Uniformity passed by the Parliament in 1662. Now, yes, Brian. Well, we have to go back to Cromwell. Cromwell in 1552 drove out Parliament. He drove out Parliament, and his driving out of Parliament was called Pride's Purge, because the person through whom he did it was an officer in the army named Colonel Pride. And the reason why Cromwell drove out what was left of Parliament was because the majority of that Parliament was Presbyterian. And as Presbyterians, going back to the Solemn League and Covenant that the Parliament had signed with Scotland. Remember the Westminster Assembly that had met under the auspices of Parliament's authority. It was Parliament who appointed the Westminster Assembly. And remember, not only did the Westminster Assembly produce obviously the Westminster Confession of Faith, the larger and shorter catechisms, it also produced the Directory of Church Government, of Worship and Church Government. Now, the intention. Now, that all came about because of the Solemn League and Covenant. Remember, according to the Solemn League and Covenant, the Parliament was wanting Scotland's help with their difficulties with Charles, and they said, "Well, we'll help you, but in order for us to help you, you've got to agree to certain things." That was the Solemn League and Covenant, whereby they would come up with a confession of faith and a church government that would be consistent with that in Scotland, and then the intention would be to impose the same thing on Ireland. Now, Cromwell wasn't independent. Cromwell was an independent, and at the same time, he had a very, very well, for lack of a better word, he had something of a very liberal policy of religious toleration. So those were two factors. Another factor with Cromwell with respect to Parliament as to why he why he drove them out, was because Parliament was not keeping its promise to pay the army. That was another thing. Moreover, this Parliament was not holding elections, so in some case, Cromwell was reported to have said, you know what, an immovable Parliament is even more obnoxious than an immovable king. So, because of those factors, Cromwell drove out the majority of Parliament in around 1552, and then what's left is called the so-called Rump Parliament. And then afterwards, Cromwell just saw that the Parliament was absolutely useless. They were not going to hold elections. They were not going to keep any of the promises that they made. So it's one of those ironic things. So they go to war. Parliament goes to war with the king because the king dissolves Parliament. Now, because Parliament isn't doing what Cromwell thought should be their job, Cromwell dissolves Parliament, and then he rules as Lord Protector, as a type of military dictator, for the next for about the next 5 or so years. Now, so what happens is the Presbyterians were not too happy, Brian, on being on the receiving end of what Cromwell did. And then to also make this whole picture a bit more complicated, the Presbyterians, many of them who are Scottish, and hence the Scots, were very upset over the execution over Charles I. That to many of the Scots, because remember, Charles was by virtue of his father, Charles at this time was both King of Scotland as well as King of England. So the execution of Charles I in 1649, and then all the stuff that happens with Cromwell driving out Parliament, makes the Presbyterians very upset, to the point now where the Presbyterians, having been on the negative receiving end of some of Cromwell's policies, some of them start making common cause with those we might call conformists, those who are very much in favor of the centralized institutional ecclesiastical structure before that. So they kind of make common cause, and they're holding right during that period when Cromwell dies. They're seeing that his son Richard is kind of weak and incompetent, so they take his weakness as an opportunity to go ahead, hold Parliament. They resume parliamentary elections. The Parliament gets seated. Once a new Parliament is seated, they are not happy with this whole Commonwealth business. They certainly were not happy with Cromwell. They thought this military dictator as a Lord Protector, and then tries to regulate the people's social life and things like this, closing theaters and that type of stuff. People were not happy with that either. I mean, even today in England, when you ask most people about Oliver Cromwell, now there are some people who speak of Cromwell very favorably, largely because of his very generous policy with respect to religious freedom, because it was during that time that all these other different nonconformist groups, especially the Baptists, thrived very well, not only in England but also in Ireland. But other than that, because of some of the other restrictions that he imposed, especially regarding social life, Sabbath observance, as I said, closing theaters and restricting entertainments and things like this, people were not happy. And even today, most people in Britain would not speak very positively of Cromwell even today. So there's this kind of residual effect that some of this had. So that provided the climate, wherein then various people, whether they were Presbyterians or those who were conformists, and even some independents, they made common cause. Cromwell was bad. This guy's weak and incompetent. His weakness and incompetence is now giving us an opportunity to elect a new parliament, which they did. And then at that point, that parliament was able to remove Richard from office, and they just gave him a decent retirement, and that's how he spent the rest of his life. And then that gave them the opportunity to call the heir apparent, who would be Charles II, from exile in France, because remember Charles I had married a French princess. So because through that line they were related to the French royal family, the rest of the family was able to go into exile in France, and that's where Charles II spent most of his most of what we may call his coming of age years. So he comes of age there in France, and then in 1660. When the new parliament has been elected, it's been seated, they're now in a position to just send Richard Cromwell off to a retirement someplace, and then call Charles II back to England to take the throne. Does that make any? I know it's pretty complicated. Does that make any sense? Because, the fact of the matter is, Brian, the Presbyterians were they had the privilege of being on the receiving end of Cromwell. So the Presbyterians find, it's not just the conformist to the centralized institutional establishment that we wanted to replace with a Presbyterian one, because by the way, the Presbyterians still wanted a centralized institutional national church. They still wanted that, except they want it to be Presbyterian rather than Episcopalian. That was the main difference. So what they wanted was, the Solemn League and Covenant with Scotland gives us an opportunity. Okay, well, we still want the same Church of England. We still want a centralized institutional Church of England, a national Protestant church, except we're going to get rid of bishops and replace them with ascending councils of elders. And we're going to replace the 39 Articles with the Westminster Confession of Faith and Catechisms. And what we want to do is replace the Book of Common Prayer with the Directory of Public Worship. That was really the only essential difference. The Presbyterians also wanted this centralized institutional national church. And so because Cromwell saw that they're wanting to impose the same kind of thing, except this time with Presbyterian elders rather than bishops, Cromwell said pretty much no way, because he was an independent. And I'm not going to let you do that, because I have an advantage over you. I've got the army. Well, it's our army. We funded it. Yeah, but you're not keeping your promises to pay them anyway. So the army serves to my advantage. And since you're not doing your job anyway, you're not keeping your promise to pay the army, I'm just going to kick you. And besides, all you're wanting to do is replace bishops with Presbyterian type elders and councils. I'm just going to drive the rest. I'm just going to go ahead and use the army to drive the rest of you out. You can just join the conformists. And the only way to make anything work at this point is for me to just go ahead and just do this myself as Lord Protector. And that's exactly what he did. So what happened, Brian, was the Presbyterians, being on the receiving end of the same thing as the conformists, decided simply to make common cause with the conformists, and then some other parties who really didn't like Cromwell's rule, and so they were able to hold elections and get a new parliament elected. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah, this is when, again, Mikey, this is when it gets very, very complex. See, what happened was all the Scots were interested in was maintaining their national Presbyterian church. That's all they wanted. And they were upset that Charles, through Archbishop Laud, was trying to impose this version of the Book of Common Prayer on their church. Moreover, the Scots were upset that he was going to impose a type of episcopacy on them rather than their Presbyterian church government. So that's all the Scots were interested in doing, and so they wanted to put Charles in his place, because remember, Charles is not just King of England; he's King of Scotland, and so the Scots viewed him. And since the Stuarts were originally Scottish, the Scots viewed Charles as essentially one of them, although he was born and raised in England under his father, James the Sixth/First. But the Scots still had an affinity towards Charles. He's our king. He's also one of us. And you, Lord Protector, had no business in committing regicide, in executing him. The Scots were very upset by that. Now we have to back up a little bit as to why Charles was eventually executed, because this was scandalous in English history. This is the first and only time in English history where a monarch is actually executed. A monarch is executed by the state for treason. This is the first and only time in England this ever happened. And so, why did this happen? Because the Scots did not like Cromwell, and they thought because they thought Cromwell was wanting to go too far with various things. And so what happened was Charles was kind of secretly arranging for another war with the help of the Scots, who would be helping him this time. So there's kind of a plot. There's sort of like a surreptitious plot going on, where Charles is trying to get some help. He's trying to get some help from the Scots. He's trying to get some additional help from the Scots, who would then help him wage war against Cromwell and his forces in Parliament, and put him back and more or less restore him to a position of strength. Does that make any sense? And at the same time, he wants to help the Scots. At the same time, along with the Scots, he's also wanting to get some help by way of some of the Irish. Now, the Irish are Catholic. Now there is a Protestant presence, but the tensions, and by the way, that's even reflected today in many of the problems in Northern Ireland. But there were always tensions, especially in Ireland, between between Protestants and Catholics. But Charles, being a pragmatist, he was even willing to get help from some Irish Catholics to make common cause with the Presbyterian Scots, to make war on Cromwell in Parliament, so as to put him in a stronger position as king. Because essentially, what happens is Charles, after the battle of Marston, especially after the Battle of Marston Moor, the king is in a very circumscribed position. Now Cromwell was willing for him to remain as king, but essentially what Cromwell wanted was he can remain a king, but he can have really no real role in government. Well, obviously, if you were raised according to the divine right of kings, that's totally unacceptable. And so what Charles was trying to do was he was trying to bide his time, and through various agents and so forth, and by the way, even the Scots thought that Cromwell was going too far, because remember, as I said, Charles is king of both places. So the Scots still want him as their king. That's a whole other factor. So what he's trying to do is he's just trying to secretly work through various agents to make arrangements with Scotland to start another war with the English, and with Cromwell and the parliamentary forces, so as again to put him in a stronger position. Now, had that been the case, had he been successful, most likely Cromwell would have been arrested, tried, and executed himself, along with the various parliamentary leaders who were leading the army against him in the first place. So, with all of that being the case, with Charles being executed, that was too much that was even too much for most of the Presbyterians. A good number of the Presbyterians, and especially the Scots, thought that was completely, totally that was just crossing a line. Because, as I said, all the Scots wanted to do was just put him in his place. All right, remember, king, remember your place, leave our national church alone, and that's it. And in their judgment, Cromwell went way beyond that. And so there's that factor, plus the fact that the English Presbyterians were now on the receiving end of Cromwell's purge. They're the Presbyterians are kind of circumscribed in national life, along with the conformists, and so now there's a common thread. The common element here is we don't like Cromwell. We don't like Cromwell. We don't like this. We don't like this protectorate. We don't like this. We don't like this whole Commonwealth that he set up, which has turned out to be nothing more than a type of military dictatorship. We were better off with the monarchy that we had. So let's just go ahead. So yes, what we're going to do is we'll just lay our ecclesiastical and theological differences aside, mainly ecclesiastical differences. We're going to lay our ecclesiastical differences aside. We'll make common cause, make arrangements for another parliament to get elected, and then let's just go ahead and just kind of reinstitute what we had before. Yeah, this is pretty. Yeah, I get it, gentlemen. This is pretty complex. It is. It's pretty complex. So, with all that having been said, the monarchy is restored. In 1660, 2 years later, this new Act of Uniformity is passed by Parliament. So the Book of Common Prayer, somewhat revised, put back in place. This is the liturgy, order of service, and so forth that every church in England henceforth has to use. The institution of episcopacy is back, and to ensure uniformity. This is why it's called the act of uniformity. We're not going to allow for this kind of chaos that happened here during the Commonwealth under Cromwell. No. That is absolutely chaotic. It makes our society less than Christian. The society is plagued by the proliferation of aberrant groups like the Quakers, Fifth Monarchy men, and all other kinds of different groups. Especially these pesky Baptists who want to dissolve the whole Christian state anyway. And there's no more of this. In order for the society to be stable again, the church is going to be stable, and in order to ensure that kind of stability, there must be uniformity. So therefore, the centralized institution is going to be reestablished. Bishops are back. Book of Common Prayer, revised Book of Common Prayer is back in place. All churches in England have to agree to use it. The pastors are going to have to conduct their office in various ways that this is going to prescribe. So you're going to have to preach a certain way. You're going to have to dress a certain way. You're going to have to conduct the service according to the very letter of this revised Book of Common Prayer, and to ensure your integrity in all this, that you're going to and make sure that you are going to do this, you're going to all have to take an oath to uphold the a revamped royal supremacy as well. And so they make it in order for a pastor to remain in his church, to remain in his charge, he is going to have to swear an oath where he's going to have to do all this. And one of the people who would be required to do this would be Richard Baxter, who is pastoring this church in Kidderminster. This church in Kidderminster comes under the jurisdiction of the Church of England, as now sort of, institutionally reconstituted by this Act of Uniformity, and so now he's going to have to swear this oath and agree to do all this. Well, there were as we mentioned a couple of days ago, there were 2,000 ministers, 2,000 pastors who refused to do this, which included Richard Baxter. Richard Baxter was one of those 2,000 who refused to do this, and as a result, they are all forcefully ejected from their churches. They're en masse, all 2,000 of them who refuse to take the oath to do all this. All 2,000 of them are forcefully removed from their pastoral charges. And it's for that reason that we call this, gentlemen, as we mentioned a couple days ago, just by way of review here, the Great Rejection, the Great Ejection. Now, what did being subject to this great ejection look like for Richard Baxter? Well, arguably, this is probably, from a temporal standpoint, this is probably the greatest tragedy of his life. Because as a result of this ejection, Baxter now faced a lifelong ban on preaching, continuous harassment by authorities, a trial, arrest and trial, serving time in jail on several occasions, and the loss of everything he had, everything he owned, through continuous and excessive fines. Now, but what's interesting here is, though, and I wish I could, and I wish we had time to go into more detail about this, but it's in the middle of all this that one of Baxter's primary concerns is directed towards the disunity among Christians. Now, here he is facing all this as a direct consequence of a stand that he took, along with 1,999 others, and yet living in the midst of this, he's very much distressed by the disunity among Christians within his country and throughout Europe. He was very distressed by the fact that you have Protestants now debating, contending against other Protestants, both, especially there in England, because it was this type of thing that led to this. It led to the Civil War in the first place. I mean, here what distressed him was, here you have people of the same, generally reformed evangelical beliefs, bitterly and irreparably divided. It was this division and this continuation of division that, in his mind, brought about the Civil War in the first place, the horrible and then just some of the many, many horrible aftermaths that followed. And now the current circumstances are just serving to further exacerbate those divisions. And so living in the midst of all this, Baxter, and again, we don't have time to get into all the details of this, but he makes serious strides to work towards unity among Christians, in this case, in England. Now, once again, in the middle of all this, living with the harsh reality of persecution and deprivation, guess where his thoughts are directed once again? His thoughts are directed towards heaven again. Once again, thoughts of heaven are comforting him in this discouragement as well as his deprivation. Moreover, he meditated on the communion of the saints in heaven, where Christians would be united in their worship of God. In fact, Baxter often spoke about the communion of saints as being one of the greatest components of heaven's joy. We will finally be, in reality, one. We won't be contending against one another over all these various things, including various aspects of justification. It's really interesting. We don't have time to get into all the details about this, but Richard Baxter actually had a little bit of a literary debate with John Owen over justification. But nevertheless, being utterly distraught by the utter disunity of the visible church, and as he was directing his thoughts towards heaven, he was then focusing on that particular aspect of heavenly bliss that's characterized by a full realization of what the communion of the saints actually is. All believers, everywhere, every time, of every place, being in union together in the worship of God for eternity. Now, 2 weeks after, here's another interesting aspect of his life. Now, 2 weeks after the great ejection, after he's thrown out of the church there in Kidderminster for refusing to take the oath and go along with this new act of uniformity, he gave up his singleness. Yes, throughout his entire life up to this point, he was single. But of all things, after getting kicked out, after losing everything, he gets married. Isn't that interesting? And so he married a woman by the name of Margaret Charlton. And she turned out to be the absolute love of his life. Yeah, can you imagine? Can you imagine? Oh yeah, I've gotten kicked out. I've lost everything. Maybe now it's time for me to get married. Wow. But that was the case. That was the case with him. And she, as I said, she turned out to be the absolute love of his life. She helped him very astutely navigate some of the very challenging pastoral situations. Now, here's what's very interesting. He's kicked out of his pastoral charge, but he doesn't stop pastoring, except now he's pastoring surreptitiously and therefore illegally. So now he's pastoring illegally, and his wife is helping him do that. So his wife is in the name of this undevoted, selfless love, his wife is helping her husband, among other things, break the law. But nevertheless, she's helping him navigate through these very challenging pastoral situations, which he's still interacting with, albeit now in a pastoral role that, from the standpoint of the English government, would be regarded as illegal. She was his continuous companion and helper. And so altogether, they had a happy marriage. After 18 years of marriage, Margaret died in 1681. He was grieved. He underwent serious grief over this, and he expressed that grief by writing about her life in a memoir. And in so doing, guess what? He once again, in the midst of this grief, writing about his wife in this memoir, he directs his thoughts towards heaven. He states the certainty of heaven as a place where God's people enjoyed him and each other never-ending joy. And he was certain that Margaret, the now departed wife, was among them, and he expected to join her at some point. So what's interesting here is that for Baxter, meditations on heaven are now serving as a great joy for him and comfort on this road of grief. Now we come to the end of his life. In 1691, Richard Baxter at last departed the continuous sufferings of this life for the heaven he always contemplated, while surrounded by him to dwell eternally with his Savior, who was himself this pastor's eternal reward. And as he laid on his deathbed, he continued to encourage people who were visiting him on his deathbed to remain faithful to Christ. He said to those who came to him, now note here, he's saying this to people coming to him while he's on his deathbed. They're coming to comfort him. But while he's on his deathbed, he's trying to comfort them. And here's what he says. You came here to learn to die. I am not the only person who must go this way. Be sure you choose God for your portion, heaven for your home, God's glory for your end, God's word for your rule, and then you need never fear, but we shall meet again with comfort. And indeed, in short, we can say, as we look at Baxter's life, obviously as a Christian, but also for our purposes here as a pastor, we see that he lived in heaven while sojourning on earth. That's how he viewed the Christian life. And that is the Christian, and that is the view of the Christian life he sought to engender amongst the people to whom he ministered. That the Christian life is one in which we simultaneously live in heaven while journeying through earth. And so, just in sum, as we wrap this part of our time up, Richard Baxter's life and ministry demonstrated this principle, which would stand totally contrary to the slogan of a certain megachurch pastor located in Houston, Texas, USA. Our best life is not here. Our best life is not now. Our best life is not to be found here and now. In much of the world today, and again, gentlemen, and again, obviously, this is pursued in different ways depending on context. But in the world around us, which obsesses with pursuing pleasure, fleeing pain, particularly those of economic difficulty, sickness, war, and a host of other uncertainties, Baxter gives us a helpful example, not just as believers, but also as pastors, ministering to people who are often faced with these kinds of things nonstop on a daily basis. And this life, and here's the lesson and here's also the lesson he gives us, and one of the many ideas that we can also cultivate in pastoral ministry amongst those to whom we are ministering, beginning with what God does in our own lives. And that is, this life is not the pinnacle of our existence. The next one is. And even though Baxter used the joys of this world to help him vividly imagine the next, he also knew that, quote, God's servants have not their portion of good things in this life, end of quote. The best life cannot and will not be found in this one, but instead it is to be found in the next, when we shall experience perfection in us, perfection in others, and will rejoice forever in the glorious presence of our Lord, where all things ultimately work together for good. So I'd like to conclude, and I put this in your note, and I think I put this in your notes. I'd like to conclude this portion of our time with regards to Richard Baxter by calling our attention to this poem composed by Baxter, that very eloquently as well as summarily expresses his seeing heaven through this life. It's called The Covenant and Confidence of Faith. And here it is. And just meditate on this with me as I read through it. And think of this as how you would incorporate this, or the essence of this, in your understanding of the Christian life, and certainly from there in your approach to pastoral ministry. Now it belongs not to my care whether I die or live. To love and serve you is my share, and this your grace must give. If life be long, I will be glad, that I may long obey. If short, yet why should I be sad? That shall have the same pay. Christ leads me through no darker rooms than he went through before. He that into God's kingdom comes must enter by this door. Come, Lord, when grace has made me meet your blessed face to see. For if your work on earth be sweet, what will your glory be? Then I shall end my sad complaints in weary sinful days, and join with the triumphant saints that sing Jehovah's praise. My knowledge of that life is small. The eye of faith is dim. But it's enough that Christ knows all, and I shall be with him. Samuel, that's a great question. Although Richard Baxter was not what we would call "quote unquote" formally educated, he was still nevertheless well educated, and he was extremely well read. I think certainly he would have, certainly he read Latin. He read Greek. Arguably, he also read Hebrew because then he learned this from various other pastors in the areas where he grew up. So all that to say, although he didn't go through university, Baxter at the same time had the basic equipment with which to read, with which to interact. So it's likely Samuel he was influenced by a number of things that he read, and he never stopped. As a pastor especially, he never stopped reading and studying. And so most likely his views developed from that, but also as a pastor, certainly in the face of practical things as well. What might really be interesting at some point, and I'm sure there's been work done on it, but it would still be interesting to investigate, Samuel, and that is to see what were the possible sources of Baxter's view of justification. That's that's a great question. Great question. Other questions or comments here regarding Baxter or anything that we've covered here? Go ahead, AB. AB, that's an excellent question. Well, it's a complex question. And so we have to remember that when we weigh into those things, when we consider those things, we have to distinguish very carefully between what's become a political issue that is at essence a moral issue. A moral issue, an ethical issue. So I think first of all, as Christians, as pastors, we need to first of all view the world, view society, view the actions of government and things like this biblically and theologically. That's the first thing. And as we do, then if an issue comes to the fore, we have to ask ourselves, all right, because we have to understand that this context of the 21st century is very different from that of the 17th. That's an important thing we have to keep in mind. And obviously, the context here in Ethiopia. Let's just be very immediate. The context here in Ethiopia is going to be very different from, even today, from any number of Western contexts. And then to make it even more complicated, the context here in Ethiopia is going to be very different from perhaps, the context of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's going to be very different. The context here is going to be the context in Ethiopia is going to be very different from Kenya, or it's going to be very different from Chad. It's going to be very different from Somalia. It's going to be very different, obviously, from South Africa. So we always as pastors, we have to always keep in consideration our context, the context in which we're ministering. And so when it comes to a given issue that becomes a political one, we have to ask ourselves, all right, Is this a moral and ethical issue that has serious biblical implications? That's the first thing we have. That's the first thing we have to ask ourselves. That's first and foremost. And if that's the case, to what extent does a government action on what is at root, first and foremost, a moral, ethical / biblical issue affect the lives of those to whom we are ministering? And that can be, and again, the context is going to, that's, and how we determine that, AB, is going to depend on the context. So again, coming back to Ethiopia, those kinds of issues are going to look very different in Ethiopia, and especially as you as a pastor are trying to sift through those issues that you're convinced that are of a moral, ethical, spiritual nature as informed by Scripture. The context here is going to help you. It's going to help you determine that. Using that, but you're using a biblical and theological framework to determine that. And then, if you as the pastor working within this context see that that's the case, then there are times when you do have to do a couple of things. There are times that as a pastor, publicly speaking, you do have to assume what we'll call the prophetic role, and speak to that. As a matter of fact, Josh and I were just talking about this. I think it was yesterday. The theologian Kevin Van Hooser published an excellent book called "The Pastor as a Public Theologian," and I would highly, and whenever you have a chance, AB, I would highly recommend that you consult that. So there is a sense, depending on the national context, the regional context, and then depending on the issue the issue in question, it's up to you as the pastor within your particular context, prayerfully to determine if XYZ issue is of a moral, ethical, or spiritual nature that's going to have XYZ effect on the people to whom you're ministering. That's the first thing. Now, and again, according to context, it's going to look very different. Those kinds of issues in the United States are going to look very different. Are going to most likely look very different from what such issues would be here in Ethiopia. Now, there's a difference. Now, having said all that, I wanted to state it positively first. There's a difference between that and you as a pastor just simply aligning yourself with a certain political party unquestioningly, to the point where you're sort of, pardon me for using this phrase, baptizing the agenda of that political party, and then trying to present that as almost being simultaneous with the gospel. And again, gentlemen, I'd be interested in hearing from you as to what that might or might not look like here in Ethiopia, or in Kenya, or in Muhammad's case, Somalia. But I do know that and I'll just use my own country as an example, if I may. I know that in my country, there are very, very, very conservative evangelicals who they might mean well, but there's a tendency in my country with these people to unquestioningly ally themselves with a particular political party, and in so doing, they take all of the they take all of the ideas of that political party and present them in such a way and advocate for them in such a way as if they're the gospel itself, as if they're as if they're scripture itself, and they're not. And in some cases, human nature being what it is, secular, any kind of a secular society being what it is, there are going to be things with that political party, regardless, that are not just simply unbiblical, but quite honestly quite anti-biblical. And so it's important that pastors not do that, in my opinion. View issues individually within the regional, national, local context. View them first and foremost. View them biblically. All right, does a government? Here's this issue. Is it a moral issue? One that, depending on how the government acts on it, is going to have a profound effect on the people to whom I'm ministering. And when I say to whom I'm ministering, I mean, yes, those in our congregation. But remember, as a pastor, kind of incorporating this parish concept for just a moment, remember too, as a pastor, your ministry arguably is also to the community as well. So you try to keep that in mind. And then speak to it in that vein. It is, I would seriously question the wisdom. And again, I don't know what again, gentlemen, you have to help me out with this. I don't know what the tendency here in Ethiopia would be. But I would avoid at all costs, gentlemen, the temptation to uncritically and unquestionably align myself with XYZ political party and just kind of and then just start adopting their agenda, because not only is, and this is just, again, in AB, this is just my point of view. Not only are you running the risk of committing a certain kind of syncretism, you run the risk of alienating people. You run the risk of undermining your own ministry and depriving yourself of the opportunity to minister to others, because they see, oh, this pastor just publicly bragged about this guy over here and some of his, who holds to these awful policies. What kind of, I'm not going to have anything to do with you. How are you going to be able to minister to me because I believe whatever? Because then what that does is, when a pastor allies himself like that, then it has serious pastoral consequences, because then what happens is you end up dividing. You ally yourself in that way. You end up dividing your church. I'll give you an example just give an example from the United States. Now again, it's my impression here in Ethiopia that there is a very, very high conscientiousness with regards to, especially here in Addis, with regards to COVID, the masks and so forth, and the various public health measures that have been taken. I've noticed that. And I've noticed that even here, various people are very, very conscientious even about physical contact, hence the fist bumps, the elbow touches, and so forth. Now, believe it or not, now again, I don't know how this is played out here in Ethiopia, because quite honestly, I think you've had more in the last several months or so ago, you had more immediately pressing concerns. But in the United States, you had pastors who ally themselves with certain other parties who just were obnoxious in denouncing all this and saying, well, this whole mass business, you're depriving me of my freedom, and all this type of thing, and I'm not going to do it, and nobody's going to do it. And what happens is, and I saw this, and gentlemen, I saw this where I lived. This was right in my backyard. Because pastors acted like this in going along with this stuff and taking this hard stand against masks. Masks are evil and all this business. And you're infringing on my rights and this stuff. Well, guess what they managed to do, gentlemen? They managed to split their churches on account of it. We have to remember, what we call the theological virtues are faith, hope, and love. And I would say, AB, at the end of the day, being aware of our context, being aware of what the issue itself happens to be, and whether or not that is it is an issue that has serious biblical implications, and how a government's action is on that is going to affect the people to whom we're ministering, not just here within the four walls, but within the community, because as pastors, we also see ourselves, hopefully, as ministering to the community around us as well. How does our action regarding this coincide with faith, hope, and love? And if our action if it's a biblical issue, a spiritual issue, that just happens to become incorporated into politics, and then some government action is going to, on the basis of that, is going to have some kind of effect, then the way that we deal with it has to coincide with, all right, is it going to coincide with these values of faith, hope, and love? And then if it's through that prism of those virtues, which we're trying to also cultivate among those whom we serve and minister to, then assume the prophetic function and speak to it. But if there's no way that any action, you may have a personal opinion and that's fine, but there's no way that how you're going to, if there's no conceivable way that that any way of responding to that is going to coincide with faith, hope, and love, forget about it. Leave it to the providence of God. But you know what? If it's not going to be dealing with that kind of with something that is of a biblical, moral, or even ethical nature, there's a 97.9% probability it's not going to, any position on that, it's not going to necessarily lend itself to faith, hope, and love. And if it doesn't lend itself to faith, hope, and love, it has nothing to do with your responsibility as a pastor, and you need to forget it. Just chalk it up to a matter of private opinion and focus on ministering to the well-being of the people committed to your charge. Because as you're doing that, that's going to have far-reaching community effect. And then that's how we, by the grace of God and by the power of His Holy Spirit, function as salt and light, as our Lord called us to do. I know that was a very long answer, but it's also very complicated. It is very easy for pastors, just with other human beings, just get caught up in the heat of a moment, the heat of controversy, and then because of your position, you end up unwittingly canonizing the agenda of a certain political party, which is something that we don't really want to do.